Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on which part of the state, I guess, timeline y'all are on. Today for Webinar Wednesday, we have Dr. Katie Mason, who is going to be talking about managing pastures for Youngstock and dry cows. We had a couple grazing schools on these earlier this month. If you missed it, don't worry. We'll probably do some more this year, and if not, next year for sure. But she had some great information to share, so I'm glad we're able to share it this way as well to reach all of you who are able to join us in the grazing schools. So Katie, do you want to tell them anything else about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. So first, thanks for having me. You'll notice under my name, my title is Extension Beef Specialist, but my background is in grazing systems. And so as we all know, grazing livestock can all utilize forages nearly the same way, and especially our dairy and beef cows. And so today we're going to really talk about that focus on the plant and the animal interaction. So I'll be ready to get started when you are.
All right. So just as a reminder, we will record this and post it. So if anybody has to jump out early, don't worry about it. I'll send it out later out this afternoon. And do not forget that if you need master dairy credit for this, please go to, let's see if it's still saved on here. Nope. I'll type it back into the chat. You're going to need to go to https://tiny.utk.edu/ww2021 to fill out the post-completion survey. And that's also been added into the chat. So I'll keep throwing it up there. Katie has it on her last slide, but if you need master dairy credit, don't forget to do that at the end of the day. So without further ado, I'm going to hide my face and mute myself, and Katie, take it away.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and hide my video as well, just to keep everybody hopefully online and able to hear. So let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about managing pastures for young stock and dry cows, specifically because we know that the requirements for dairy cattle tend to be pretty high for energy and protein, and they can be somewhat difficult to meet with pasture. But there are some of our younger animals, or those that don't have such high nutrient requirements, that we can utilize pasture for. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So let's, if I can get my slides to go. There we go. Maybe. There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about the goals of grazing management. Just why do we want to utilize grazing management practices, the balance between plants and animals, and then we'll talk a little bit about grazing methods and how they can be used to accomplish goals in any grazing operation. So when we think about the goal of grazing management, we want to make the most efficient use, both in our production and utilization, so the way that we actually harvest and utilize forage, to meet the needs of our livestock. So here in the Southeast, we're lucky in that we can graze for quite a bit of days out of the year. And if we utilize that forage base well, then we get a lot of grazing days out of it. And in the beef world, potentially can cut down on some supplemental feed costs. And then maybe as well in the dairy world, especially with those animals that have lower nutrient requirements. So the overall goal here is short bouts of grazing with longer periods of rest. And you'll notice that I don't have specific numbers there. So it's hard to assign a value of what does a short amount of grazing look like. But basically those are relative to one another. So for the time that cattle are on a pasture, we want that amount of time to be shorter than the time that they're off of that particular pasture. So short times grazing with long periods of rest for that forage to be able to recover and replenish its root reserves so that next time around it can be grazed again. And the way that we achieve this goal is by implementing grazing methods. And so we're going to talk about how those methods differ in efficiency and how we can implement those in our total grazing system. I always like to assign some objectives behind my goals. So what are the actionable items that can actually get me to accomplish that goal? The first one here is to manage the pasture and feed inputs to efficiently produce animal products. So we're producing pounds of milk in the dairy world, right? So we want to make the best use of our feed in order to get the best production and most efficient production out of the feed inputs that we have. The big one here is to manage forage quantity and quality. So the amount of forage that we have, as well as its quality and nutritive value. And we want to manage that over the grazing season. So we'll talk about how different forage species grow at different times and maybe how their nutritive value can change throughout the season as well. And then finally, adjusting stocking rates to improve grazing efficiency and animal production per unit of land. So we'll talk about how we can change the number of animals or even change the amount of forage or acreage that we give to those animals to make the most efficient use of our land, and also improve the total production, so total pounds of milk that we're getting per acre of that land. So in grazing systems, we have to make sure that we balance the plant's needs and persistence with the needs of the animal. And so when we think about the plant and forages in particular, forages as a crop are somewhat of a unique situation. So in typical crop management, say we're planting corn for corn silage, and we're going to plant that at the beginning of the planting season. It's going to grow to a certain endpoint where it's harvested and put up for silage. And then that's the end of that crop season. Then we can come in with something else, or, the next year plant another crop of corn. But for forages, these are going to be harvested continuously over the season. So there's not just a one-time harvest and then that's it for forage. They're going to regrow. And so we want to make sure that we're grazing them to a point where they can recover from that, leaving some residual leaf area for them to capture sunlight and regrow so that we can come in and get another grazing off of that same forage crop. And then in terms of the animal, we always say that cattle farmers are grass farmers first. If we want to meet the requirements of our animals, we have to have something for them to graze. And in order for them to have something to graze, we have to meet the requirements of that forage plant. So this goes to soil health, soil fertility, rest and recovery periods. And so really, while we're talking about the needs of the animal, we have to think about the grass first, and then use and manage that grass in a way that supports the needs of the animals. So let's dig a little bit further into each of those things. First, I want to explain the growth stages of forages. And so this curve just shows a very standard growth curve. This is for just all forages in general, not a particular species. But basically what it shows us is their rate of growth. So how quickly they're growing. That's this curve that's kind of an S shape. And then their days of growth. So kind of across the growing season. And we see that early in the growing season, either once this forage has been planted and has emerged, or once it's come out of dormancy, if it's a perennial plant, it's going to be kind of slow growing. So we don't want to get on that forage too early. If it's early in the season when fescue is just starting to green up, or if it's something that's an annual that's just been planted, we want to give it time to establish a root system before we start to graze, because it's still kind of in a stage where it's vulnerable, and we don't want to get on it too hard at the beginning because we can affect the growth later in the season. Then as we move into phase 2, you can see that the growth becomes much more rapid. So these plants are actively and rapidly growing compared to early in the season. And sometimes it can even be hard to keep up with these forages once they enter into this production phase. And so we want to manage our forage in this vegetative phase as much as possible, because this is going to coincide with the time that our forages are of the highest nutritive value. And then finally, as plants enter into phase 3, which is their reproductive phase, they'll start to put on a seed head and flower, and they'll become mature. So they'll start to put on more fiber components, and we'll talk about what those are in a second. But this is the part where the quality will really start to decline. It's going to be at the time when those plants are mature and cattle cannot utilize them as efficiently. So we're trying to keep plants in this vegetative growth stage, but not remove so much leaf area that we're affecting the persistence long term. So I mentioned that there are root reserves, and what that means is there is energy stored in the roots in the form of carbohydrates. And for that plant to be able to regrow, it's going to pull those carbohydrates up from the roots and start to put on more leaf material. And so if we illustrate what that looks like, you can see here we have a plant, and the root mass underneath the ground is similar in mass to what would be above the ground. So what our forage availability is here. And as we go in and harvest leaf material by grazing off of that plant, there's going to be some root dieback, I'll call it, but it's a natural process. And this is just something that occurs because these leaves have been removed, and it's going to have to pull some of those root reserves up. But if we leave some of this leaf area behind, it allows those carbohydrates to be replenished through photosynthesis. So in our grazing management, we want to go back and forth between these stages of grazing and then stages of recovery. But if we continuously graze that plant and graze it too much, so if we've removed too much leaf material, eventually this plant's roots are going to die back so much that the plant can no longer persist. And so you may see bare spots, especially in perennial pastures where plants have been overgrazed. And then if there's additional stress on the plant, like drought, then that can further make that problem even more serious. So we want to make sure that we're leaving plenty of leaf material behind so that we can encourage persistence long-term of this forage base. I always like to mention the term optimize. So we don't want to maximize quality, we don't want to maximize yield, because as we can see from these two figures, there's a balance between the two, and they're kind of opposite of one another. So our quality is going to be the highest at the point when our yield is the lowest, but we don't want to graze here because we're going to affect the persistence of that plant. And then if we look at the flip side of that, when our yield is the highest, then our quality is going to be the lowest because of the way that plant has matured and started to add more fiber components. So we really want to, again, graze or harvest forage at the time that coincides with an optimal, so a balance of quality and yield, and that's going to be in that vegetative stage. So this figure on the left towards the bottom, you can see that there's just a little bit more detail added, but it's similar to the figure at the top, but it essentially shows you how the crude protein content will decrease, and the leaves, the number of leaves compared to the number of stems, will decrease as well. So as leaf material begins to decrease, that's when you're losing quality. Quality is really found in those leaf components. And so as the plant matures, we move into a more stemmy plant, more fibrous plant, and that's when it becomes a little bit harder for the animal to utilize it. Now, when we think about the plant and the way that it grows throughout the year, this is called its growth distribution. And this is going to be dependent on the species of forage, but ideally we would like to have the same amount of forage all year, or at least greater than what we need to be available year round, so that we wouldn't have to balance, back and forth how many cattle we have on there, how much forage is available. But in reality, we know that's not true. So this is a tall fescue growth distribution, and we can see that there are times of the year when fescue is more productive, which is going to be in the spring, and then again in the fall. It has a period of summer slump, we call it, during the time that it's going to be partially dormant. And also if it's endophyte infected fescue, it's going to really cause heat stress problems as well. So we have to think about the times of year that our forage is available and growing, and then maybe things that we can fill in the gaps with. Specifically for tall fescue, crabgrass works really well to fill in that summer gap. So this slide just goes a little bit more into detail with some growth distribution for different forages. This is forage availability for the zone that we live in, Zone C. And you can see different species here are available at different times of the year. Tall fescue, again, that curve that we saw just before. And then some other forages, orchard grass and Kentucky bluegrass, will be typically found in our pastures, have a similar growth curve. And then in the summer months, some of our legumes may be more available. And then Bermuda grass, we don't see as much of that here in Tennessee, but it can grow, but it's really not going to provide a very long growing season. So crabgrass would be where we could fill in that summer slump for fescue. And so it's important to know what species that you have so that you can know when your grazing system is going to be most productive. And the way that you identify forages most easily is either by their seed head or the time that they're actively growing. So if you go out and you have forage that's really actively growing in the spring, then you can determine that it's probably one of these tall fescue, orchard grass, or Kentucky bluegrass. And then you can start to look for seed heads, which I have a couple pictured here, orchard grass and tall fescue. And you can start to determine what forages you have available so that you can make kind of a greater grazing plan, know what times of year that your forage is going to be most productive and when you can make the best use out of it. And then because a lot of our pastures are mixed species pastures, we don't typically grow a monoculture of a pasture. Monocultures typically are going to be for hay production, but in a pasture, it's really not a bad thing to have multiple species, especially because they do have different growth distributions. And so there will be times of year that one is more actively growing than the other. And so we'll have more of an extended grazing season because of that. And the way that we can estimate what our species are is one, to know what species are actually there. So using those seed heads and growth curves to figure out what species you have. And then you want to look at ground cover to see kind of what the composition, the breakup of those species are. Is it 50% fescue, 50% orchard grass? And then determine from there, again, when that pasture is going to be most productive. Another note that I always like to make is the presence of bare ground is best detected by looking down at the ground and not across the pasture. So if we were to look at, and it's a little bit hard to see in this picture, but if you just looked at this picture kind of from where you would be standing right here in front of me, this looks pretty productive, right? It looks like there's a good bit of forage there. But as we walked through that pasture, we got to parts where there was some open ground, and I apologize, I don't have any good pictures of that. But there were some open bare spots. And so we couldn't see that by looking across the pasture. We had to get into the pasture, and we placed these plastic quadrats or frames down on the ground and then look down from the top onto those to determine the amount of bare ground or the different species that were available. So that we could make decisions about when we might get the most production out of that pasture, and even when we might need to renovate a pasture or add additional forage into it if it's really starting to become thin. So really it's important to get out and do a pasture walk. You can't just ride by your pastures and look at them. You have to really get out there, look down into the canopy and see what's going on there to get a good idea of what the production will be. I want to mention forage quality real quick. And a lot of times when we think about forage quality, we tend to focus on this nutritive value. What is the percentage of crude protein or the percentage of energy that's going to come from that plant? But really, we have to think about it kind of in steps from the beginning. So the first part of forage quality is palatability. Will they actually even go eat it? So is it a plant that cattle want to consume and they'll go out of, not necessarily out of their way, but they'll actually consume it instead of waiting around to see if they're going to get an option of something else. And then after that, how much will they eat? So will they actually eat enough to satisfy their requirements, or will they need to be supplemented with another type of feed or forage? Once they've eaten it, once they've actually taken it in, we have to think about how much can be digested. So how much can actually be utilized. And that's going to be based on fiber concentrations in the plant. And then finally, once it's gotten to that point, what is the actual nutritive value? What is the amount of protein or amount of energy they're going to get from it? So we have to think about this whole set of questions when we talk about forage quality and how that impacts animal performance. So every bite will count towards their performance and their requirements. But at the end of the day, if they won't eat it, it really doesn't matter what the quality is. Let's transition to talking about the animal. So we've covered the kind of the basics about plant persistence and forage quality. Let's shift to talk about how the animal fits into this system. So animals have a nutritional requirement that they have to meet every day, and we find those requirements in textbooks called the NRC, and these are tables that are put together by nutritionists that can tell us based on a targeted performance. So here we have average daily gain of 1.2 pounds per day. Based on that targeted performance and the body weight of our animal, we can determine how much they're going to need to eat in dry matter. So this would be 6.8 pounds of dry matter per day for a 200-pound non-bred heifer. And then we can see concentrations of TDN, which is a form of energy, metabolizable energy, and crude protein that is needed in the diet. And so one point to make is that these nutrient requirements are always changing, right? So as the animal is growing, their crude protein requirements will change, their energy requirements may change. And so we have to keep an eye on what forage is available to them so that we can best match the requirements of the animal to what forage we have available. And then when we think about the amount of forage that they actually eat, in terms of dry matter, fresh forage or pasture is only about 20% dry matter. So it's a lot of water, a lot of moisture, and it would be like us eating lettuce. And so they have to eat a really large amount of this fresh forage to be able to meet their requirements. And so the example here is a 1,200-pound cow can eat 240 pounds of grass to meet her requirements in a day. And if that grass does not have if it's not very nutrient dense, then basically they've filled up on water and then they haven't gotten a lot of nutritive value out of it. So this is something to keep in mind when we're thinking about how much forage really has to be out there for our cattle, and then how much they can actually take in and hold in their rumen at a time. And then we have to, again, think about, is it palatable? Can they digest it? And what is the nutritive value? In terms of intake and forage quality, the one thing that we focus on is fiber components. And NDF, or neutral detergent fiber, is essentially all of the fiber components of the plant. Those include hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. And those are of varying degrees of digestibility. So this really is just kind of almost like a total fiber number. It's not crude fiber, but it includes all of the fiber components. And we can see from this figure, we have dry matter intake as a percentage of body weight. Typically, we say as a rule of thumb, 2 to 2.5% is kind of the target for our animals, 3% on those really high producing animals. And we can see that as neutral detergent fiber, or the percentage of fiber in the plant goes up, the dry matter intake goes down. So there's an inverse relationship here, meaning that the more fiber components that plant has, the quicker the animal's rumen is going to get full, and they're not going to be able to continue to eat more and more of that forage to meet their requirements, because they've reached their gut capacity. And until that forage is broken down and passed through, no more is going to be available to come in. So breaking that down a little bit further, I just talked about how NDF was related to intake. And then we have ADF, or acid detergent fiber. So this represents the cellulose and the lignin components of the plant, and it's related to digestibility. So we talked about the intake first, how much can they actually take in, and then how much can they digest. So when we look at ADF values, ADF percentages, this will impact how much of that forage they can actually digest once they've gotten it into the rumen. And so as the ADF increases, we can imagine that digestibility obviously would decrease, similarly to the relationship between intake and NDF concentration. And then finally, Our lignin component is 100% indigestible. And as that plant reaches that most mature stage is when the lignin starts to really tie up the components of the plant. It makes it hard for it to be digested. And the cattle, one, get full on it very quickly, and two, are not actually able to access the nutrients that would be within the plant itself. So this figure just illustrates that same thing. At a certain point, there's going to be a decrease in intake because there's a physical limitation of the size of the rumen to be able to eat that over mature plant. I always like to share some numbers when I talk about these concepts, just to give you an idea of what this looks like in terms of animal performance. So this was a study completed where they looked at 150 days of grazing, and they compared what they called a high quality tall fescue pasture, which meant that it had legumes incorporated into it, meaning it was higher quality than just a grass stand would be. And it was also mowed periodically. So mowed to reduce some of that over mature material from being there, and even the seed heads as well. And then they had a low quality pasture, which was only mowed once. So some of that forage was able to get a little bit over mature, and the cattle were going to have to eat that, but potentially wouldn't be able to digest it as well. So if we compare the intake, the the digestible dry matter intake, and then the cow final weight and the calf weaning weight, we can see across the board that intake and performance is what I'll call this, was greater in the high quality pasture than the low quality pasture. And what this demonstrates is that we need to try to manage our pastures in a way that they maintain their quality, and that can be by adding legumes or mowing or rotational grazing, so that we can get hopefully better performance from our animals out of those pastures. And then another point that I like to make, I teach this this concept to my students in beef management. I really like for them to think about how the cow grazes and how she has to use her mouth parts and her tongue to take in forage. So if we think about pasture and how a cow grazes, they utilize their tongue to kind of wrap that forage and tear it off. They can't nibble forage down to the ground like a horse can that has upper incisors. And so there has to be enough forage available for them to actually be able to grip and take in that forage. And so if we see cows standing in a pasture that looks like a golf course, then they're probably not going to be able to utilize much of that pasture because they can't physically grasp and tear that forage. So this video just shows that process in slow motion. All right, so you can see how in the longer grass, the cow was able to wrap its tongue around more of that plant material and tear it off than maybe they could in the shorter pieces. And then even here, there's a lot of bare ground as well. So potentially lacking on forage availability in this situation, but I think it's a really good demonstration of how the cow actually grazes. So let's go ahead and talk about, this really gets to the point of that balance. So there has to be a compromise between the animal and the forage. And where we really can manipulate that is within our stocking rate. And so this figure is called Mott's curve. Mott's curve is well known to people who have studied grazing management and forages. And basically what it illustrates is a balance between animal output or animal performance and the number of animals per acre, or the stocking rate. And it shows us the output per unit of land area. So what are total pounds of of milk or animal product is per acre, and their output per animal, total pounds of milk per animal. And we can see that there's a balance here. Again, we're looking for that optimal zone. We want to make sure that we're not undergrazing, that we're making the best use of our land resources and not leaving a lot of waste out there, but also that we're not overgrazing and potentially harming the persistence of that plant. And so here in this optimal zone, we've reached a point where we've gotten not the greatest in terms of actual value, so not the highest amount of output per individual animal and not the highest amount per land unit area, but we're making the best of both of those things. And so this, again, just demonstrates how we have to strike that balance between the two to make sure that we're making the most efficient use of our pastures to produce our animal products. So let's talk about what those grazing methods actually are and the efficiencies associated with them. When we implement grazing methods, we want to improve the grazing efficiency. So that means use more of the forage than we would if we were just continuously grazing. Reduce pasture waste. So make sure that we're not leaving a lot of trampled forage or soiled forage behind. Conserve surplus forage. This I'll demonstrate, or I'll show you a figure that you can see how you could set aside some hay or silage area, not allow cattle to access that, and you can put up that surplus forage for a time later in the year when forage may not be as available and actively growing. We hope to increase animal performance and then improve forage quality at the time of use. So maintaining that forage in its optimal quality, that vegetative stage. If we look at the efficiency of our different grazing methods, basically we have continuous grazing, which is going to be the most simple method. It's just putting cattle out there and not doing any type of management in terms of rotation or really giving that pasture time to rest. And then as you start to add rotation or intensify the grazing system, then the efficiency increases. And this efficiency is just the amount of forage use. It doesn't relate to the efficiency of the animal. But you can see that in a slow rotation versus a moderate and then a strip grazing, we're going to get about 10% better use each time. And so really just the point I always try to make is any amount of rotation will be better than none. Just to define what that rotational stocking or rotational grazing is, this is a system where the grazing area is divided into smaller paddocks, and that can be with the use of temporary fencing. So it doesn't have to involve, a lot of permanent fence. And basically you would allow animals to rapidly graze and then move off of that paddock into another paddock and allow that paddock that was just grazed to rest before you come back to it. I'm a visual person, so I like to make these animations and really show what this would look like. Of course, we don't all have a square farm, but for simple purposes, I just wanted to illustrate it this way. This is our whole area of land, and we've added some temporary fencing in here. We've split this up into 8 paddocks. And if we had a rotational stocking system, we would put all of our cattle or some amount of our cattle on one of those paddocks at a time. And then we start to rotate. Once we've grazed this one for some number of days, we'll move them here, and then we'll just continue to move them throughout each of these paddocks. And by the time they get back to this last one, it has rested for all of the days that they were grazing these other ones and is finally ready to be grazed again. It's had time to replenish its root reserves, to grow more leaf material, and able to support cattle again. So just to the point of that surplus forage, maybe we rotate cattle through just 6 of these paddocks, and maybe we leave these 2 down here undisturbed by the cattle, and we can go in and take a hay cutting or a silage cutting off of these if we have forage that's starting to really get ahead of us and we need to put it up. Then we can get a uniform crop either hay or silage off of these areas and just allow cattle to rotate through these paddocks. So if we didn't have this separated off, then we're not going to have a uniform and dedicated area to conserve that surplus forage. When we think about the pros and cons of this system, one, there's an increase in utilization, and we talked about that. Incorporating any rotational grazing is going to increase the utilization of forage. You can manage your excess in a more flexible way, again, with either cutting hay or stockpiling, matching the animal nutrient requirements to what's available. Improve pasture management skills. So of course, as you get out there and do it more, you become a better manager of that grass. And then finally, nutrient distribution. So as cattle graze, I'm going to go back to my figure here. If we had no fences, none of these temporary fences put up, and we had water up here in the corner and some shade, along this area, then cattle are going to tend to, especially in the summer months, hang out over here, right? They're going to congregate around the water. They're going to hang out under the shade. And while they're doing that, they're going to be excreting nutrients in the form of manure and feces. And if they don't really have much reason to come over to this far side of the pasture, then we're going to get a buildup of nutrients in this area and then less nutrients over here. And the great thing about cattle is they can recycle nutrients and add those back into the soil like a natural fertilizer. And so ideally, we would want that spread evenly across this whole area. And by only giving them access to a small amount at a time, then they've excreted nutrients in each of these areas over time, and it becomes more uniform rather than being around the areas that they would hang out the most, shade and water and things like that. Of course, with pros, there are always cons. And so the big one for rotational grazing is going to be the investment in fences and watering systems. Going back to the figure again, if your cattle are confined in this space, they still have to have access to water. And that can be a limiting factor on how you set up your grazing system. So either a portable water or maybe setting up a lane or an alley for them to be able to get back to water is going to be important in your planning process as you set up a rotational grazing plan. Labor availability, of course, and this may be more in relation to the beef industry where we're not handling our cattle twice a day, but in the dairy world, you all are probably putting hands on cows twice a day to milk. And so this may not be a huge increase in labor, and actually may be an opportunity for you to better utilize your pastures while you already have those cattle up, towards where you're trying to put them in the pasture. Of course, it has more management decisions. It can't be as simple as putting them out there and letting them go. But you just have to weigh the pros and cons and figure out if this works well for your system. I like to mention this note on stocking rate. So we hear the terms stocking rate and stocking density sometimes used interchangeably. And again, I like visuals, so I wanted to illustrate what this looks like. Stocking rate is the big picture. So we can think about this in terms of total number of cows and total number of acres of our farm. And you can see I have in this figure 4 cows on 8 acres. And so my stocking rate is 1/2 cow per acre or 2 acres per cow. And my stocking density is the same because I have all my cows on all my land. If we think about stocking density, this is going to be sort of a snapshot. What's happening right now on the farm? What's happening today versus my total stocking rate over the year? And so I've divided my same farm up into 1 acre paddocks, and I've put all my cows on one of those paddocks. And so now I have 1/2 cow per acre, and I have 4 cow, my stocking rate is 1/2 cow per acre. So I still have the same 4 cows on the same 8 acres, but my stocking density currently in this paddock is 4 cows per acre. And so I just make that point to say that you'll hear people say, well, we're grazing 20 cows per acre. And that's not a sustainable long-term stocking rate, but it may be a stocking density for a day or two at a time. So moving on to some numbers on these continuous versus rotational systems. Again, I like to show some data to go with these concepts. And so these numbers came from a study that looked at performance of continuous versus rotational stocking on tall fescue, orchard grass, and alfalfa pastures. So a mixture that we could see working well here in Tennessee. And they compared a continuous system with a 6 paddock rotation and an 11 paddock rotation. And what they found, so they looked at stocking rate, so how many animals they could support per acre, and then the gain per hectare on these animals. Actually, that's gain per acre. Sorry about that. And so in their continuous grazing system, they were not able to support as many animals, and they did not have as great of gain per acre or animal performance per acre as they did in the rotational system. So an increase in animal performance was achieved by incorporating some amount of rotation. If we look at their forage composition, specifically focusing on those fiber components and that crude protein value, across the board, they found that fiber components were greater and crude protein was less in the continuous system versus the rotational systems. And the two rotational systems were not different statistically from one another, and probably not from a biological standpoint. A 15 versus a 16% crude protein is still going to be good compared with a 12% crude protein. And so what this demonstrates is just that any amount of rotation, again, is better than continuous, and it doesn't actually have to be incredibly intensive. So I think the valuable information here is adding additional paddocks did not really have an advantage. It just may be extra labor and extra resources. And so there are some people who intensive grazing works well for them. They may move their cattle once a day or more than once a day, but it doesn't have to be that intensive to be better than continuous grazing. I want to talk for a second about limit grazing. This is another grazing method that can be utilized. It works really well for annual forages because it is something that you want to really preserve a high quality forage, use it most efficiently. And so you're only going to let cattle have access to that area of pasture for a few hours per day. And this could potentially decrease hay needs in winter systems, could potentially decrease the amount of supplemental feed or silage in the dairy industry that would be needed in certain times of the year. And so just to illustrate that, cattle may be housed on a sacrifice paddock or a dry lot, depending kind of what their production system looks like, that have access to water there. And maybe they have hay or some other sort of stored feed that they have access to. And then for a couple of hours a day, we open the gate and we give them just a small amount of this forage. So maybe we put a temporary fence strip up here and we only allow them to graze this little bit for a couple hours. And then we put them back into this sacrifice area or back onto their perennial pasture maybe. And then the same thing the next day, give them a little bit of pasture and have them come back. And so they can access this water while they're limit grazing. But once we've closed the gate, they can't come back into that annual forage. And so we talked about at the grazing schools last week that this might work well maybe after milking. Dr. Eckelkamp said maybe after milking you could utilize that time since you've already got them up to put them in this limit grazed area for a little bit, and then several hours later come back and take them off. And so it could fit well into this dairy system depending on what the forage base is. The big question at the end of the day is always, how do I actually get started, right? How do I take these concepts and put them into play on my farm? So a couple things that you need to get started with rotational grazing. Of course, one is fencing. So this is going to be important to keep your animals in the place that they're supposed to be, and also keep the plants from having access to them when they're supposed to or not supposed to. So important on both parts. And we want to make sure we have a boundary fence, and that may be our permanent fencing, and then some temporary fencing in order to subdivide those paddocks. I mentioned that water can be limiting in a rotational grazing system. So making sure that you have a plan for either a portable water system or a way to utilize alleys or lanes so that cattle can get back to water, and so that they're not utilizing too much energy or expending too much energy getting to that water. So you don't want it to be incredibly far away, especially with these dairy cows that have higher nutrient requirements. We don't want them to spend a lot of energy going out looking for water and even looking for a lot of forage to graze. We want to give them that forage pretty readily available. This slide has a lot of information, and what it boils down to is the typical extension answer: it depends. So there is no magic number of paddocks. There's no magic size or shape. There's not a one size fits all answer to this question. And so basically you have to evaluate what your operation can handle, what the type of forage you have, what the level of production you're looking for. All of these different components will go into determining how many paddocks you need to set up. Just a couple of notes and general rules are that if you have perennial pasture, typically grazing those on very small areas, less than 1 to 2 acres, is not going to be practical. That's more for like the strip grazing situation with an annual forage. And then if possible, it's most economical and efficient to utilize square paddocks or nearly square paddocks. Again, I know that's not always possible, but if you can at least avoid long, narrow, or pie-shaped or circular paddocks, that's going to be the best use of fencing materials. Speaking of fencing, temporary electric fence is one of the best tools that you can utilize in a rotational grazing system. And there are a lot of fencing options. There are different types of polywire and polytape. It can be a single strand fence like you see here in the picture. It can be multiple strands if you have maybe smaller animals or like sheep or even small calves that you don't want to get underneath there. Different types of step-in post, fence chargers, reels, so that you can roll up your polywire. And the biggest thing is find a system that works for you, and then train cattle to respect the wire. So if these cattle have not had access or exposure to an electric fence, it may take a little bit of time to get them trained to that so that they know that that's their boundary line. And then once you start to see that they're respecting that hot wire, then you can really trust that they're hopefully going to stay where you have them fenced off. Grazing sticks are a tool that I think that a lot of producers can utilize. It's not very specific. It's not, from a research standpoint, maybe we wouldn't use grazing sticks to measure forage production, but just for a quick estimate of forage mass, a grazing stick can be a really helpful tool. And when I say a grazing stick, I mean even a yardstick. That's what I have in the picture here. There are some grazing sticks that specifically have forage related information printed on them, and they can be helpful, but you can look up that information as well. And I've included that here, just one bit of information. And what this tells you is for every inch of pasture canopy height, you have a certain amount of dry matter production. And so here I'm measuring the canopy of this tall fescue pasture, and I believe we had, I think it was about 15 inches at our canopy height. And you would want to take average measurements across the pasture so that you have a representative sample. And then you can go in and determine how many pounds per acre roughly that you have, and then start to determine your stocking rate from there, or figure out how much allocation of forage you might give to a certain number of cattle. And eventually you get good enough to eyeball it. So there is kind of a balance between the art and the science of grazing. And that's really where the art comes in, is once you've gotten really good at it, you may not need these tools as much. Real quick to go over some calculations. I'm not going to make anybody do math today, but if you were interested in figuring out specifically number of paddocks that you would need, you can do that by estimating the days of rest that you want, the days of grazing that you want, and then adding one so that you always have a paddock to go to, or always have one that's kind of that buffer. And this will tell you how many paddocks, if you're setting up a full rotational grazing system, how many paddocks to have. And these numbers, these rest and grazing numbers, will depend on your system. And this calculation, it can look a little bit overwhelming, but I like to boil it down to the top numbers up here essentially are animal needs, and the bottom numbers are forage available. So if we break that down and we think about the weight and how much our animals are going to consume, how many animals we have, all of this essentially is just our animal needs, total forage needed by the animal, and then total forage produced by that pasture here on the bottom. And so that can help you determine, again, allocation of pasture or even stocking rate. And so this just gives you that in the form of an equation. Don't let it overwhelm you when you look at it. And then I wanted to include this list. This is from a book called Southern Forages. If you're interested in learning more about forages, this is the book, especially for the Southeast. And it just had this set of rules. When thinking about moving to a new paddock, it's hard to have just a specific number in mind or a specific day in mind. And so really you just want to observe. Basically what this is telling you is look around. Has the paddock been grazed adequately? Is there too much forage left? Do they need to stay on it? Do we have forage available in the next place that they're going? Are the animals staying in good body condition? What time of year is it? So is the paddock regrowing actively and quickly, or is it taking a little bit longer? Do we have weather concerns? And so these are just some observations to think about as you move into, again, that art of the grazing system. So when we put it all into motion at the end of the day, the challenging thing about these grazing systems is we're balancing two different biologies, the plant and how it's growing and it's changing all the time, and then the animal and how it's changing all the time based on their stage of production. And so we have kind of all these moving parts that we have to focus on. And this can seem overwhelming, but essentially just start simple, be flexible, know that it's going to change throughout the year and over time as you see what works for you. Your grazing plan may change, but the easiest way to do it is divide what you have in half and rotate kind of back and forth and then go from there. So just try out a little bit and then continue to build your rotational grazing plan as it fits into your production system. So with that, I think I'll maybe left a few minutes for questions. I've got my contact information up here. Feel free to send me an email, and then don't forget to fill out that post-completion survey if you want the Master Dairy credit, and that information is in the chat box as well.
Well, thank you, Katie. You did a wonderful job as per usual. Don't know why mine's not hiding. Oh, that's because I hid self-view. Can you see my face, Katie?
Again.
Okay, awesome. That's weird that I can't see me on my screen. Got to figure out how to do that later. So if any of y'all have any questions, feel free to unmute, or if you have anything that you want us to talk about next time more on pasture management, feel free to tell us about that too.
I think I did a great job, right?
I think you did an awesome job. That means you answered all the questions and there's nothing else to ever possibly talk about. So like Katie said, please fill out that post-completion survey to get your master data credit. And if there's anything that you didn't get a chance to ask today, or you think about anything later on, feel free to email Katie or I, and we will do our best to answer it. And I'm still not seeing any motion over there as far as unmuting or throwing things in the chat. So on that note, that was a nice thing to see in the chat. Thank you. On that note, I will end the meeting for everyone, and I'll post the recording later. So hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, see y'all.